So I came up with a new mnemonic.
What is it?
I figured out double the calculation,
So you did, have you?
but it's been ignored.
But there still is value of accommodation for what can be technical, correct? I mean, the idea is somewhat assimilated for technical association. So, I mean, the idea is articulated for an advancement, correct? I mean, what can be the idea for an association if the idea is an advancement of some articulation framework?
Articulation guide.
I guess it can be somewhat a difference, but it can be somewhat technical also if the idea is articulated enough for a mnemonic of a technical claim. But the idea for an advancement of a sum isn't technical until there's been a curriculum of some form. I mean, unless there's been an advancement for an idea where you sit down and you study and you have the idea for articulation. I mean, the idea is just none more than the obligation for a written name. I mean, the calculation is just calculated for an idea of articulation.
Correct.
But it is still what can be assimilated for value of a technical term. I mean, the idea for an association is still made with the available correction, but the idea for articulation is still mnemonic of a technical association. And the idea can be an available correction once the idea can be articulated into the idea of an advancement.
It does.
But it does require rather difficult work. I mean, the idea for what can be calculated is somewhat strenuous, when the idea for what can be ignored can be somewhat a technical degree for association, but there is no available correction for what can be a technical idea for articulation once the idea is somewhat articulated into the advancement of an obligation. And if the advancement of curriculum can be somewhat of a summary, I mean, the idea for what can be a articulation rather than a difficult adjustment can be calculated through a technical definition, correct?
If assimilated.
And it can be somewhat of a technical degree for what can be association for mnemonic. I mean, the association is through accreditation, but the accreditation is through a technical term. And if the idea is articulated into new articulation video, then the idea can be somewhat of an idea for articulation of an idea for articulation. But I mean, the idea can be advanced for curriculum, but it cannot rather be difficult for what communication can become if there is an advancement for some form.
I mean, I've yet for talk for everybody inside my home.
But there is still what a technical term can be degreed for. I mean, the idea for what can be an idea for articulation is still the idea for what can be summarized into somewhat of a degree and advanced for somewhat of a articulation framework. But the idea for what can be ignored for an idea of an articulation framework is the idea for a technical association.
Thanks, tendency.
You're gonna find out what it's like for assimilate value of mnemonic through technical association, whether it's degreed through a mnemonic of a technical term of association, but the value is still calculated through an associated value of a technical degree. I mean, there can be no accommodation rather than a difficult calculation, but there can be no more mnemonic rather than a calculation of a sum of a summary of an advancement of curriculum.
If advanced and summarized.
And it can be somewhat of a dictation between what can be guided and followed between the joke of the idea of mnemonic of technical association. I mean, the idea for articulation is quite stipulated, but the idea for what mnemonic can do can be articulated into advancement of curriculum when the articulation is quite available for correction. I mean, there is no idea for what can be technical, is there? I mean, there is an idea for what can be advanced for a summary, but the idea for articulation could be mnemonic of a technical association. And the idea for what can be absorbed into calculation can be done through new mnemonic of a technical association. But it does require rather difficult stipulation for the idea of articulation for new mnemonic of a technical association, correct?
Correct.
Thank you.